Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. Today we focus on benchmark CG.3.12, compare the U.S. and Florida constitutions. In Part 1, we focus on identifying the purpose of a constitution and recognizing the basic outline of the U.S. and Florida constitutions. We focus on Benchmark Clarification 1 and Benchmark Clarification 2. In Benchmark Clarification 1, students will identify the purposes of a constitution, and in Benchmark Clarification 2, students will recognize the basic outline of the U.S. and Florida constitutions. What are the purposes of a constitution, and what is their basic outline? Let's begin with Purpose 1. What are the purposes of a constitution? First, it provides a framework for government. Remember, a constitution is a piece of paper. The only way that a constitution has value is if the people who have agreed to abide by the constitution do just that. And so, by providing a framework for government, the Constitution then provides a written plan for a government where the powers and responsibilities of the government are listed. So this is an effort to inform those who have agreed to follow the Constitution what it is that is expected of them. A constitution also provides a framework or an outline for how the government will work. In the United States, for example, the Constitution creates 3 branches of government, and it also defines the powers, responsibilities, and roles of each branch. Now, you may have noticed in your study of the U.S. Constitution that there are going to be some circumstances where the responsibilities of one branch are listed in a different branch of government in the Constitution. However, what's important is that the listing of those different people with roles is related to the checks and balances system. So let me give you an example. Article 1, Section 7 of the U.S. Constitution, which is the legislative branch and focuses on lawmaking, includes that the president, the chief executive, has veto power. Whereas in Article 2, which is the executive, there is a focus on the role of the Senate in ratifying treaties. So the focus needs to be on who has the power, even though another branch of government might have some checking authority in the process of focusing on this framework for how a government will work. A second purpose of a constitution is that it limits government authority. The U.S. Constitution outlines the limits on the powers of the 3 branches of government by creating a system of checks and balances. Checks and balances is that one branch of government can impact how one or more branches of government function and do their job. This system of checks and balances guarantees that no one branch of government can become more powerful than the other branches. For example, Congress writes the laws, but the president decides if the proposed law will be enacted. So there's a separation of powers system that separates the legislative from the executive branches that then enables checks and balances. It is very important that we remember that checks and balances are not the same as separation of powers. Separation of powers are in place that enable checks and balances. They're not the same. What about Purpose 3? Purpose 3 focuses on protecting the individual rights of the people. The Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution to list the rights of the people and explain the limits on the power of the government. And by limiting the power of the government, the individual rights of the people are protected. For example, the Third Amendment denies to the government the power to require people to house soldiers. We sometimes use the word quartering meaning housing. To house soldiers in times of peace without the homeowner's position. And this is important because this is then protecting individual homeowners from having to house the government through the military without their permission or without their consent. So how do we bring this all together? What is the basic outline of the U.S. and the Florida constitutions? Both constitutions include preambles. The preambles for each constitution focus on the goals and purposes of government. And by focusing on the goals and purposes of government, we then have a better sense about how that government is structured, which is then presented in the articles of the Constitution. There are far more articles in the Florida Constitution than there are the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution has 7 articles, and each article focuses on a specific branch of government or a specific element of the government process, such as how to amend the Constitution. And then finally, both constitutions were written to be living documents. And because they are living documents, that means that they can be amended, they can be changed. And it's a good idea to be thinking about, why would we change a constitution? Well, because times have changed, our viewpoints have changed about various things over the last hundreds of years in the U.S. case and the last many decades in the Florida case. So, for example, in the U.S. Constitution, we include amendments which extend voting rights to people regardless of their race and regardless of their sex. We also have included term limits for presidents in terms of their service, so that at the time it was believed that by adding term limits to presidents that there would not be a viewpoint that the president could become like a king and thus might abuse his power. Let's bring it all together. We see that both the United States Constitution and the Florida Constitution begins with "we the people." This means that both the federal government gets power from its citizens, as does the state government. The U.S. Constitution with 7 articles is much shorter than the Florida Constitution, which includes 12 articles. The Florida Constitution includes a Declaration of Rights, which serves the same purpose as the U.S. Bill of Rights. There are 27 amendments to date of the U.S. Constitution, and there are far more efforts that are included for the Florida Constitution to amend it, because it's the voters who vote on amending the Constitution, but when it comes to the United States Constitution, there is a more involved process that includes both the national government most of the time and definitely the state government all of the time. But both documents were written to be living documents. The United States Constitution includes the Supremacy Clause, stating that the Constitution is the highest law of the land. Whereas when it comes to the Florida Constitution, there are different issues included in the Florida Constitution, such as public education, motor vehicles, and elections. And the Florida Constitution focuses on the day-to-day issues that affect state residents. So there are both similarities and differences between the U.S. and the Florida Constitution, even though both the U.S. and the Florida Constitution include preambles, articles, and amendments. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? If so, please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.